Selman, who is a urban planner and are you an architect too?
Urban planner.
Urban
Uh,
planner. And he has written a book on dub psychology and urban planning, which is kind of funny that he found us because they're I don't know. I don't want to say we're the only blog, but I haven't seen a whole lot of people interested in fusing the study of Jung and architecture. But we'd written a little bit about that, so we're excited to have him. He has a new book, Temenos. Am I saying that right?
Temenos, that's correct.
Okay, my Greek is a little rusty. That's Greek, right?
Mine is non-existent, but
Okay.
I know that it's a term derived from ancient Greece. Imagine the plaza in front of an ancient temple. That is, while a temple was built on sacred ground, the temenos basically extends that sacred space out into the city. So that's what a temenos is.
So the sacred space that spills out from the interior of the temple.
Yeah, it's that protected holy space.
So would that be kind of like a liminal space that it's a fusion of the, our world and another one, overlapping, just like an Irish thin place or something, that it's part of the city, but also part of the temple?
Yeah, and the idea of the book is that both in our civilizational, the point in which we find ourselves in history, as well as urbanistically, we need to start thinking of the entire city in those terms, not just a special place reserved, but take as much care and respect for the city as we always have for nature.
It sounds like what you're saying is that the city should be viewed as not just kind of a utilitarian or practical thing, but a fusion of the practical and the spiritual. That we should be mindful and view it as an extension of ourselves.
Yeah, and we can see the results of not having done so for probably 500 years of this long, slow decline since the advent of science, really.
Yeah.
And just a whole complete shift in the fundamentals from which we operate has changed the places we build, not just as we think. And that's a theme that runs through the entire book, is that the places we build reflect the values we hold. And that's not working anymore. Those values don't operate well anymore.
I wonder. I don't know if you had seen the last kind of blog article video that would put out, but it's funny what you're saying. Like one of them was about the design of furniture, and specifically mid-century modern furniture, and the other one was about architecture. What Frank Lloyd Wright's process was, that he wasn't quite a classicist, wasn't quite a modernist.
Right.
But the argument in it is that we used to think of these things as something that was intentional and beautiful and meant to last and a part of ourself and kind of a spiritual thing. And then at some point, it just became this practical necessity that we throw it away, and that was to our detriment. Even if we have more stuff, even if we have more ability to hoard, it meant that we meant less. And what you had just said, that the stuff that I forget exactly. I need to rewind, but the last line that you said is almost exactly the title of the article, except with the word chair, because it was you may address the chair, where we sit tells us where we stand.
Yeah, the places we build reflect the values we hold. And like you're saying, this is an odd combination of subjects to try and tackle. And I have not, until the book was completely written and I had sent it off to a publisher, did I come up with a good 30-second elevator speech for what this is all about. And it's more like 45 seconds instead of 30, but
I think intuitives don't always know what they're writing until it's done. Like you kind of know you need to write it, and then later you back up. Whereas that's the more sensing and thinking types do not operate that way. They have a blueprint and a plan, and then they execute. And a lot of times intuitives feel called to create this thing, and then later you can be like, oh wow, that's what I was doing. Okay.
Yeah, I did not see this thing assembled itself, and I was just a tool. Very much, I could see that as it happened. I was led in various directions that really had no connection, but they all resolved in the end. And right up front, I state there's most urban designers, urban planners, I hope, know of a book called The Art of Building Cities by Camillo Sitt. He was writing in the 1880s, and he was lamenting the fact that things were not going well. Back in the 1880s, he thought that there were serious problems in what he was seeing in the way that he was from Vienna, I believe. And in that book, fairly close to the beginning, he says something like this: we can no longer build a beautiful work of art like the ancient Greeks did with the Parthenon in Athens, because we lack, how did he phrase it? We lack an overarching cosmology, an overarching vision that throbs in the lives of the people every day, that could be expressed in a work of art like a city. And so what he was basically saying was that when you are experiencing problems in urban design, the way a city is designed, operates, it's just a symptom of a much, much larger problem that we're experiencing now and have for hundreds of years. And we've gotten to a breaking point. And there has to be some sort of a shift, not in the way we design. We'll keep designing in all sorts of secondary ways until we gain some sort of larger vision of what it means to be human.
Well, and I think that's always a work in progress, right? You know, trying to figure out who we are, what we are. But we're not even trying anymore. You know, we've kind of given it, and that's what's sad. I mean, so I'm kind of, I butt heads with people because, you know, I do depth psychology and Jungian stuff. And so there's some people who are, you know, very practical. They take that in their Evo Psych and, you know, DNA archetypes and whatever. And then there's other people that are kind of new age spiritual, but you lose the psychology of it. It's just kind of too woo woo. And well, I guess everything that I want to think at any point is true, and this crystal will cure my scrofula, and you know, it becomes too unscientific. You know, what you're saying that a city should be spiritual. It's like, you know, people kind of laugh because it's a trope about like Marie Kondo. You know, basically Jung's idea of ensoulment. You know, that we should have. Martin Buber is very much like that, the mystic Martin Buber, who wrote I Am Now, and that you should have a very personal, loving relationship with everything that you interact with, animals, people. We've turned into a transaction, and it should be something that, you know, I love this chair because it is beautiful and it matches this thing, and I love this because it, you know, something that you think about. And like, so when you're talking about, you know, a lot of people kind of make fun that Marie Kondo saying, you know, hold each thing in your house and say, does this spark joy? And if it doesn't spark joy, throw it away. You know, there's something that, you know, you are happier when you have less stuff. You are happier when you're more intentional, but also the kind of the spiritual component of this stuff can be kind of grating or overdone. And so something like the Parthenon, you know, that's an attempt to find a culture of what this group of people is, the ancient Greeks. And yeah, it's beautiful and it's held the test of time and influenced, you know, so much stuff. But also, you know, it's kind of propaganda, right? You know, like the Persians are coming and you're getting kind of nervous about the scary stuff in the East. And so they, you know, it's a huge expense. It wasn't like they just had the money lying around. They chose to do this, you know, basically to control this population and to give it a vision of self. And so, you know, a lot of them, we're not going to go through the whole Parthenon, but the biggest motif there is this, you know, ordered civilization overcoming a barbaric, chaotic enemy. You know, and their war against the Amazons is what is, you know, on the outside of it. And then, you know, the Titans overthrowing the gods or the gods overthrowing the Titans and creating this new order. But it's very much about what they were trying to give the people a vision of who they were, because it was a time of crisis. The Peloponnesian War is dragging on a little bit long. There's some plagues going on. The climate's changing. Like, we're not really sure if we're going to be in charge of all this stuff anymore. We had all these great ideas, but now the blank edges of the map are getting filled in, and there's other philosophies. You know, we're not the only game in town anymore.
Right.
And it's an attempt. You know, it is gorgeous, and this attempt to provide a spiritual blueprint of this is who we are, this is our identity. But it's also kind of propaganda by the people being like, yeah, come on, look, this is who we are. You know. So, you know, both of the practical and the spiritual are part of these things.
Yeah, and it's you mentioned the sort of tension between traditional Jungian thinking, and the side of it that goes a little bit more on the woo-woo, touchy-feely side. And I sort of touch on that a little bit in. So the book is divided up into 4 sections. In the first section, I focus really on an attempt, maybe just for myself, to explain what it is, what is my personal vision.
There's a lot of your biography is in the book too. I mean, you talk about a concept relevant to architecture and design, but then you talk about how you dealt with that concept personally, in your life.
Yeah, I was raised for several years as a small child in Paris, and so I got the opportunity to have that experience of walking down particular streets embedded in me very early. And then after that, I grew up for a number of years on a small beach cottage on Chesapeake Bay, isolated by salt marshes. So the most intense urbanism and complete wild, untamed nature back to back. And so that has given me a particular understanding, I think, that I find very valuable. But that sort of speaks in a way to the tension that I see between spirituality and religion.
Mm-hmm.
In the spiritual world these days, not just in the secular world, but the spiritual community generally, the New Age world, there seems to be just an absolute total lack of respect for religion.
Mm-hmm.
Religion is false, it's fake, it's a front, but I'm spiritual. I've got the real thing. And
which is, of course, what every cult leader says,
Yeah, right. It's a great tool in the way that you can manipulate control for better or worse. I think that that can be helpful and useful. You just better make sure you've got the right leader.
I think you look for the people who like they have a monopoly. That becomes the problem. Is when I just have to. I really want you to have this great thing. It's just really the only one that can do it. That's the.
It's the only way that's going to work. Everything else.
Yeah.
And
therapy
after 50,000 years.
Therapy when you hear that.
Yeah.
None of the other things work. It's the only thing.
Yeah, for 1,500 a session. Well, I'll take care of you. Yeah. But we've been at this for, depending on the source material that you choose. There's a archaeologist, anthropologist named von Petzinger, and she has done just amazing work on cave art specifically. And her understanding is that a sort of a great awakening took place in the evolution of the species. A couple of points, roughly 200,000 years ago, and I think that's right. Check me on that. And then again, about 50,000 years ago, humans started being involved in activities that had no practical purpose.
You're talking about like the Venus of Ellendorf and the Venus figurines?
All those sorts of things. Art in general, music started to appear. Things that weren't practical necessities of life. But apparently were really, really important to our ancient ancestors. And so there is this, I imagine that this is the memory that we have of the source material for the Garden of Adam and Eve. When we woke up at some point in history, enough consciousness developed in us out of our animal instinct. And we looked around and said, oh my God, what am I? What's going on? What am I supposed to be doing? And the whole story of mythology, religion, poetry, ritual is a process over the past 50,000 years and more of figuring out that question, who we are, what we're meant to be doing here. And the idea of the book is to imagine the city is the classroom in which that exploration can take place.
Mhm.
Because the natural world, that's been our home since forever. But more and more, the world is urbanizing. I don't have that daily experience with wild nature, but I do have a daily experience with concrete and asphalt and buildings and so forth. How can we infuse those settings with the same sort of intentionality and do it on a conscious, intentional level at this point?
Mhm.
So that's what I'm trying to get at.
So, I mean, I think that does a pretty good job of explaining, how are what is urban planning, what do you do, and then what is kind of Jungian depth psychology, and what do those have to do with each other, But that probably gives, the audience a good primer of, without being super specific about what an urban planner does,
Mhm,
how somebody operating with the lens of depth psychology, what that is, and then how those two things could inform each
mhm.
other. How much of have you ever seen Adam Curtis's documentaries? Like All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, any of those?
I don't know that name at all. Mm-mm.
He's interesting. They're very loose. The thesis is very loose and implied. There's never like, oh, we set out to discover this, and then, but what we found was even more. It's very just like weird clips of culture and this overlapping of anthropology, design, philosophy, psychology, and the way that those kind of inform each other. But how much of the destruction of what you're saying, that intentionality being taken out, comes from? Well, I don't even I hesitate to even say where it comes from, but you have culture that kind of moved everything away to like a consumed experience that was the smallest part of what we do or the least of what we do. It's like, okay, I'll live in a house that I hate. So, and I won't buy the stuff that I want so that I can go on a cruise, or, I'll go into an office that I spend 90% of my time in that's awful, because I want to be able to afford to go on vacation to this other place that's nice, that I'll be in for this teeny tiny fraction of my life. But it's almost like the point of life became not our routine, not what we do for 90% of our time,
Mhm.
in this
Yeah,
strange way.
yeah,
They became about these experiences elsewhere. Um,
yeah. It's like we have such low expectations of our immediate surroundings,
mhm,
and there's such a um, disparity between what we see every day
mhm,
and what we can find as advertised in a beautiful cruise to little seaside towns on the coast of Italy or something like that. Um,
mhm.
our ancestors did things so much better than we did, and it's because of the things that we hold as being more important.
Mhm.
And for us,
So what would you say that is now? What is the thing that we hold to be more important than our self, our intentionality, our
it,
soul? What do we? What's
it's
the altar?
well in a well, two different directions to go with that. One is very specific, and I'll say it's the car.
Mm,
The car gives you freedom,
mhm,
right? You can go anywhere because I've got a
mhm,
car. But we spend so much time and effort making sure that the car gets everything it needs so we can go anywhere that we don't create a
and
place
income.
to
What
go.
is
There's no place
part
to go.
as a part of annual, expenditure by families? And it's probably about the same. Poorer people drive a cheaper car, but it's the same percentage of income as the richer person driving the nicer car. But it becomes this thing that you have to have.
I think I saw somewhere that car ownership is equivalent to a $50,000 a year mortgage.
Mm,
You want a nicer house, get rid of one of your cars.
mm,
I'm car free now. I had a 3 hour a day commute for several years. And every year I got rear ended at a stoplight. And the last time was by a drunk driver doing 45 miles an hour. Three cars were totaled. One guy was in rehab for 2 years. And I decided not to replace the car. My intention in moving back here to Washington, D.C. was to be car free. It's the metro, my bicycle, my feet. And if I need to, I can rent a zip car.
mhm,
Um, so we've created a mindset of mobility to the point where we've completely forgotten that there ought to be a place to go to.
mhm.
that's part of a larger story that I guess Jung would speak to. And that's basically the transition from I don't know what the traditional mindset to the modern scientific mindset, which basically arose, 1600s, basically when science started to take over. And you can sort of see this in the history of, no, that's Western civilization as a whole, but alchemy specifically. Alchemy goes back 3,000 years, and it was always basically a spiritual practice, and an effort to understand the spiritual realm by the processes of the physical realm. And somewhere around the 1600s definitely, that became the precursor to what we know now as chemistry. A very, very different way of thinking. And you can see the decline of alchemy coinciding with the rise of science. And so now nothing.
Well, and just to kind of parse what you're saying for the audience there, if you're not familiar, because even people who like Jung, alchemy famously ended his affair with Tony Wolff. Jung had a menage a trois for a while, and then he got too into alchemy, and it ended. A lot of people have a hard time following Jung there, or they don't know what it is, and so basically, you have pre-scientific, evidence-based practice. You have people basically personifying nature. They assume that this stuff works like us. Well, the moon's not a planet. This is something about me in relationship to me because I need it, and so the projection of our own psychology into science, basically assuming that lead would turn into gold and that chemistry and mineralogy would work based on the way our own psyche works. It's this projection. So people are kind of telling on themselves. So when you look at alchemy, there's all this stuff about you take the thing that's not very good, but then you purify. And this is a gross oversimplification, but then you purify it and it goes through trials and it gets stronger and it gets harder, and then you get the unique good center, and the gold is extracted from the chaff. And there's this idea of psychological growth and spiritual development that we were sort of assuming science worked like, because that's how we work before we had science. And then chemistry comes and says, actually, these things don't care about you at all, and they have nothing to do with you. They're neutrons and electrons, and this stuff is just completely random and arbitrary, and you are unimportant. And you've got to memorize all these numbers if you want to do anything, which has a place. And so that's kind of what you're saying, is that we took ourselves out of the world, or we took, our spirituality out of the world a little bit too much. And I don't want to speak for you, but just to clarify people that may not be familiar with some of those terms.
No, that's a great summation. And so when you make that sort of transition, you're dropping off. There's 50,000, 200,000 years of human experience that you're starting to ignore for the sake of something that's really 500 years old, maybe. A very, very dramatic shift in thinking, and science and the technology that grows out of it have done absolute wonders. But it's come to a point where maybe the harm is starting to outweigh the benefit. And what's really interesting is that subatomic physics, particle physics, is getting to the point where it's about as esoteric as any ancient philosophy. In the theory, the point at which energy transitions to matter and so forth,
or that something can dually be a particle, a wave, and an energy that is partly present in this galaxy but also disappearing, so maybe it's going another place. These are what these, I'm not a scientist, but this is what theoretical physics is saying, which is sort of the best operating assumption we have right now. One thing that I think is related to you kind of talking about the spiritual and the scientific is I'm playing with my webcam here because it's starting to fall. There's two places where I think another author puts Jung better than he puts himself. Like, Jung is trying to say something and then he's not able, because he's a pretty brilliant, articulate guy. One of them is
easy to read, though.
No, not easy to read. One is ego and archetype. I think Edinger, when he comes
Mhm.
in and says there's two parts of self. There's this existential, objective thing that is only what we create, and then there is this completely subjective, kind of myopic, spiritual oneness. And they don't know how to be in the same head. That
Mhm.
kind of existential, the intersection of existentialism and mysticism. I think Edinger summarizes better than Jung. And the other one is Tacy in Edge of the Sacred. He says, that what Jung is saying is that there's these three different levels to us, and we haven't quite culturally, and we haven't really gotten to the next one yet, but we need it, because if we're
Mhm.
going to be saved, that's the thing that saves us. And the first one is just mythology projection. We assume that everything is about us, and we project our psychology onto the world, and we live in this kind of spiritual myopic place. And then science is the second one that develops and says, no, actually none of this is real. You're totally unimportant. That's all silly. It's not logical, and it's not objective, so it's not real.
Mhm.
And science gives us these things, but ultimately it rings kind of hollow when you're trying to build a society based on the assumption that humans are not important or needed or special or anything, and that the third layer that he says that he kind of wanted Jung, that he thought that Jung wanted us to attain, was this idea that you do have science, that you can operate with an objectivity and a logic, but that you have to be willing to not make that everything, and say that there is still an openness to things that we do not understand in a spiritual realm, and that there is an openness to and it's kind of hard to articulate the third lens, because he's saying like science is important, we need it, but also we're not really existential creatures. We're spiritual beings, and we need to have a relationship with that.
Mhm.
And one of the ways Jung thought that would happen was through theoretical physics. He drinks a lot of red wine with Pauli and
Oh yeah,
Einstein.
I've been reading the dream analysis that Jung did of Pauli and his
Mm-hmm.
world clock, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's it. Jung was very much a shaman
Mm-hmm.
in that sense of, in fact, he related his clinical methodology to shamanic, or not shamanic. I'm sorry, um, alchemical processes.
Mm-hmm.
7 steps and so forth, 5 steps. But I think that's what is needed in a civilizational sense right now.
Mm-hmm.
That bringing together of those opposites. Um, and so in thinking about cities, uh, our cities look like infrastructure now, because
Mm-hmm.
that's all we think of them as. The overhead wiring, the electrical transformers we see on telephone poles.
Mm-hmm.
You just think if your house was built that way, with wires running across the living room and so. No, we hide that sort of thing in conduits behind the walls, because it's not
Mm-hmm.
attractive. But out in the public realm, we don't think about that at all, because it's just stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to bring back that sort of soulful, artistic
Mm-hmm.
valuation of place.
I mean, just the idea that we could bury power lines. You don't have to just be looking at like wires and crap and transit.
Right,
This stuff could just be under the ground if we wanted
right,
to spend the money to value that, more.
right.
I think one of the big examples for me is like where we send our kids to school. American high schools and middle schools, they're built like prisons. They're black, windowless, or not, maybe not black, but they're windowless cinder blocks surrounded by fences. And I mean,
Hmm.
sometimes barbed wire. And it's just like, what are you teaching your children?
Right, right, right.
And I don't know. I feel like one of the idea that you're talking about is kind of scary to people, because I mean, when you look at the public sphere, like one of the fastest ways to get people to just have this emotional reaction to you and hate you and attack you is if you just say nicely, you know, hey, could we just dare to maybe imagine that the world could be a little bit better than it is now? If you just say, hey, this thing that everyone agrees is really bad and sucks, could we
Can we
maybe
do
just
something
work
about
on
it?
it? It's like, but you see people who just gently say that, and it's like left and right, and people are like, oh yeah, you're a Democratic pedophile, or you're a Trump MAGA, what? Like
Right,
the guy's
right.
just saying that like our life is not great and it's
Yeah,
going in a bad direction, and maybe we could make a baby step to
yeah.
a thing that was a little bit better.
Well,
Um,
I enjoyed your interview with Dewani
mhm.
some time ago, and he's the only person I've ever seen. I've worked with him on a few occasions, um, and as an urban planning consultant for 30 years now, I've been in
Mhm.
enough public settings where I've been attacked as a communist and a Nazi in the same meeting, um, which was lots of fun. But
Well, and then the third political party in America that nobody talks about, or I call them like the radical centrists. It's like the people who they're like, well, the truth always has to be between two bad ideas, and you're like, what? I mean, does it? I mean, this maybe, know, like it's like they don't want to be seen as like extreme or bad or anything, and so they don't
yeah,
stand for anything, and they just have to compromise with whatever. And
yeah,
both of them do it. Both kind of parties do it, but you'll just see these things where somebody was like, look, you have to make a decision. Do you want to pull out of the war? Do you want to do this? And there were just a lot of times where Obama would be like, what if we just send half the amount of troops and do nothing? And it was just like, man, like, or, and you see, Romney and people do the same thing where it's like, they're just too
yeah,
afraid to be like, yeah, this is the right direction. And I'm going to go there. And I mean, that's probably a
yeah.
bigger voter base, those kind of,
Being offensive is the worst crime you can commit now, I think.
they're believing in something, it's
Yeah.
just,
But what's interesting, I was going to mention Dewani. He's the only individual I've ever seen um, in a public setting to be able to look an audience in the eye and say, what you're doing sucks. This
yeah.
is pathetically bad. And
Hmm.
there are so many ways to improve, and you're too stupid to do something about it. He'll literally use those terms, and people love him for it.
Well, and
Um,
I think that's why you get innovators in America kind of have this trickster energy, like this,
mhm,
because we're so, I don't know, we have such a weird relationship to like the Messiah complex, and but like because the culture really likes the status quo, doesn't want things to change.
mhm.
Somebody could never come in like Dwani and say, hey, Paris does this and this works better, and like, why don't he has to be like, no, screw y'all, this blows, like, do that, no, like, and um and you get innovators do that. I mean, I see that in psychology, because I don't think therapy as a whole is in a great place. We basically over relied on cognitive therapy, which cognitive therapy is fine for some things, but it meant that we only study therapy that we can turn into a number. And I mean, the therapy modalities that you can turn into an objective number suck. They don't have the intuition of the clinician. They don't have the intuition of the patient. They don't make room for a relationship, frankly. And they don't treat trauma, because they're only talking about behavior, and behavior is the last step in trauma. But you see that in all these fields. These people have to kind of come in with, it takes somebody with enough energy to kind of blow something up in order for there to be change. I mean, it
Right.
doesn't seem like other countries, other cultures work like that.
I think we are sort of at the the cutting tip, the cutting edge. Um, when I think of the long, slow decline of Western civilization, um, like Jung said that the scariest place on Earth was the United States. He was
Yeah,
he
I
was
think he was scared of it too.
feared of the U.S. because of our incredibly powerful tools that we have and the naive way we think about them.
And it was such a new country and such a big country and
Yeah,
becoming such a powerful country. I mean, this other stuff, it had gone through these experiments, early on, and the U.S. was just the Wild
yeah,
West. I mean,
yeah. It's like, well, we actually do this now, but it's like giving an AR-15 or whatever they are to a 12-year-old.
yeah.
Um, here's this big thing. I can do anything with it, but there's not the life experience and the wisdom to make good use of it. Um, so how do you go about starting to change that? And I don't think that you do. In one sense, I'm pretty pessimistic. Um, it's like when ancient Rome started to collapse, there was a real loss of respect for its traditional religions. Jupiter and Minerva, yeah, they're all these ancient gods, but they're silly and shallow, and they have all these domestic fights amongst themselves, and there's just nothing there anymore. And what the Romans would do 2,000 years ago is take pilgrimage to ancient Egypt, because there, the ancient religion was even older, and it was mysterious. There were all sorts of strange rituals, and the gods were different, and that was somehow respected. Because the old was collapsing and the new, which eventually became Christianity, had not yet arrived. And I think that's sort of what's happening here now. Christianity, in a sense, has run its cycle through history. And it's, I think I would be willing to say, it's as great a source of wisdom as the world has ever seen. But we sort of sucked the juices out of it. And it has devolved into a cultural dinosaur, in a sense. The life has gone out of it, and I think that's kind of a natural cycle.
Well, these things never quite die. They put on new clothes, but you have a language you cling to for a while,
right?
And it becomes irrelevant, and then you rediscover the same thing,
right.
with a new language.
In a different language, different symbols, and so forth. But we're in that in-between time, and that hasn't happened yet. And so we're going off in all sorts of odd directions, whether it's New Age spirituality or MAGA or whatever it is. We're looking for anything until we settle on something new. And my sense is that the city can be a point at which that something new can be the soil in which that something new, that new vision can take hold. And it would be great to prepare for that in some fashion by designing a container for soul to come into, which in the past was what we did.
Yeah,
it was a container.
Well, we're kind of mixing metaphors here, but the metaphor does work as a microcosm or macrocosm. Jung saw religion as this thing that sort of contains the unconscious, so that you have, until you're ready to hold it, you have something telling you how to live. And then the goal isn't just to be a slave to that forever. The goal is to have it protect you, like a mother protects a child until they're ready to take on more responsibility. And then you start to understand these things with a little bit more nuance, and you start to be able to do them. But the city sort of does the same thing. We don't have cities that protect people. We don't have cities that provide a nice space. And I mean, I would be surprised if most people in America even know what an urban planner is or that it exists. I mean, I think we have this kind of libertarian attitude that I buy this box of land and then I build my stuff in that box. And if you want to build something, then you put it here. The idea that there's a central vision that says hey, wouldn't it be nice if there was a park in the middle of the city? Wouldn't it be nice if there were bike paths that cross this so that we don't get people killed by cars, but you can also ride a bike? Wouldn't it be nice if there was a pedestrian walkway that went over here so that you couldn't just walk one street, you could walk across the whole city? And, I don't think people know, in your world they do, but I don't think the average person knows that that's something that happens.
No, they're often shocked when they walk into the planning office to get a zoning permit. What do you mean there are rules and regulations?
And then they get angry,
And then they get angry if somebody takes the next door property and wants to build a coal refinery or something next to them. If I get to do anything I want, then so does he. And that doesn't accrue to civilization.
Are you familiar with James Selman, the Jungian analyst and writer? I don't even know if he qualified as a Jungian analyst by the end of his life.
What was the name again?
James Hillman.
Oh, good Lord. I've got him. A lot of this book started after I read City and Soul. But that's pretty much
he's
all
interesting
I've
to me
read.
because he is you take. Well, I mean, Hillman's career is interesting. I mean, he's brilliant and he has a lot of really good ideas, and then he also is kind of a crank in a lot of areas and like really loud about it. And you know, he like a lot of male Jungian analysts kind of goes into the woods by the end of his life. But to me, there's always like he was that those are all very American archetypes. Like he took Jung's ideas and brought them to America and kind of got eaten by its own thing. I mean, there's like he's a little bit of a hustler. You know, he grew up in Atlantic City. He like here's the people, you know, calling on the boardwalk, and he's kind of talking about spirituality and Jungian things in that way that, you know, there's something to it, but it's also a little bit of a grift, you know.
Yeah, I always got the sense that nothing ever satisfied Hillman. He was never satisfied, and I got the sense it was because you know, he was from one of those early generations right after Jung, and he felt that he should come up with some
Great
grand, some great new thing, and it never quite happened.
Yeah.
He's got lots of little gems scattered all around, but they don't ever coalesce into the full formed.
A lot of his books are kind of like J.J. Abrams movies, where it's like line by line they work, you know, shot by shot, and then you back up and you're trying to sit with the argument of it. And it's like, wait a minute, if you're gonna shoot the missiles at the Star Trek ship, then why would you put the people in it? If you thought that, you know, none of it works. It's just a compelling scene to see these things open, you know. And Hillman kind of writes like that. But when I talk to Leon Creer, it's funny because I've always been kind of afraid. I've always kind of related to Hillman and felt like my own worst impulses that I needed to check were ones that he overindulged, and you know, you feel that energy. When I talked to Leon Creer, he was like, "Oh, I met this guy a long time ago in Zurich. He was a lot like you, James Hillman. Do you know who he is?" And Creer told me that Hillman said to him, "You know, America, you go to Europe and the buildings are supposed to pull your eye upward so that you're always in communication with the divine. You're always contemplating heaven, and the lines go up. And you go into American buildings and we put a drop ceiling and we put fluorescent lights to make you not look up, to make you stare down into hell."
Perfect. Yeah. And so there are, you know, with that, it's really hard to find good models here. And the last third of the book, I guess, I focus on where I am now, Washington, D.C. What L'Enfant did in his design for Washington, D.C. was very much a political and spiritual metaphor. And we don't see that anymore. We don't know about that. And partly that was because L'Enfant didn't tell people what he was up to. But the whole story of L'Enfant and the way he designed Washington, he and George Washington very much held a vision of the United States becoming the grand global empire built on ideals. And so Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new world order. And so many conspiracy folks now are worried about, you know, this new world order that's coming. Well, it was there from the beginning. That was the whole point.
On the top of the Washington Monument, right?
Yeah, there it is. And well, the Washington Monument has an amazing story by itself. But what L'Enfant was doing, he didn't just lay out the streets. What he started off by doing was creating what I call a trellis. Just like in your backyard, you build a wire trellis so that vines can grow up and life can flourish. He created a geometric trellis out of which the street system grew and the location of buildings were placed. And it was based on what we now know as sacred geometry, which again is sort of getting over there into the woo-woo side of things. But
they were into that, though. They didn't see that there. You know, we study them, but we don't study their assumptions. You know,
right. We love what they did, but we don't respect their methodology.
And you saying that people don't know that about DC, I would argue that design is something that we don't see, we feel, right? And so a ton of people have these emotional reactions to this stuff because it works. But you start explaining it to them and they're like, no, I didn't know that. So that's not why I like DC. And it's like so many people that have lived there, you say, oh, I'm going to DC to see my sister or something. They're like, oh, Washington, I lived there. And then the cherry blossom and it's like they have this relationship to it because it's different, but they don't know it. I mean, it's our capital. We don't even know what it looks like. You watch movies and they're always like the snipers up there and the Jason Bourne or whatever. And they're like Washington, DC, and they fly over it. And it's like New York or Toronto. There's like these
right.
like 70-story buildings. And it's like DC is flat. Like it's intentionally like it's not, you can't build that. It doesn't, we don't even know what it looks like. You're able to substitute this wild stuff in movies and people don't recognize it who've been there or lived there.
I hear tourists on the subway all the time, pointing out, okay, over there's the Capitol. No, that's the White House. Very, very basic stuff like that. But what L'Enfant was trying to do with this sacred geometry was to basically relating the power of the White House, the power of the Capitol, symbolically using the meaning behind ancient geometry. So in the ancient world, the number 5 represented the earth and its people. So
you can say a little bit about why that is, or what that assumption is.
So there were, in the ancient world, numbers and shapes had meaning. There were certain things ascribed to it. So, for instance, the Jewish flag, the Israeli flag, has the six-pointed star on it. Those are actually 2 triangles, one facing up, one facing down, which is essentially meaning the earth reaching up to heaven and the heavens reaching down to earth. So those sort of symbols were built in everywhere.
Or even the seal, that kind of like a lot of schools and institutions, there's that lemon-shaped seal like that. And I went to Swanee, but it's the overlap of 2 spheres.
Right.
It's
like the
heaven and the
Western
earth
version of the yin yang symbol. It's 2 circles and their edges touch each other's center. It's called a vesica piscis. It's the reconciliation of opposites. And in fact, L'Enfant used that in his creating the trellis for Washington. So with the number 5 representing the earth and its people, the number 6 represented the gods in heaven, wherever this came from back in Mesopotamia, 5,000 years ago. And so what L'Enfant did, you'll often see people saying the Masons were designing secret symbols in the streets of Washington.
The Masons were assuming everyone thought that at the time because they did. All educated people kind of were operating on all those myths.
Well, yeah, what L'Enfant was doing was not some secret Masonic.
And they weren't seen in conflict with Christianity, like people feel now if you explain it to them.
All architects, all artists knew of these principles back then. It was common knowledge. It's only secret now because we dispense with it. We don't believe it.
We forgot it, so it's a secret.
We forgot it, so it's a secret. But the number 6 is represented by Connecticut and Vermont avenues reaching out from the White House, forming an equilateral triangle above the White House. The number 5 surrounding the Capitol building. So for instance, Pennsylvania Avenue, Massachusetts Avenue form the sides of 5-sided stars. L'Enfant didn't design the entire star, but parts of them are there. The metaphor is the tension between the gods in heaven, the president, the king, with number 6, and the earth and its people at the Capitol building. Earth and heaven, how do you reconcile those 2 in tension? Earthly politics, dirty, crappy methodology, compromises, all that, with your heavenly aspirations. How do you reconcile those 2, both in yourself, your personal life, and as a nation, as a culture, as a civilization. How do you balance those two?
Mm-hmm.
That's the metaphor that he built into the city.
Well, and it required this new design language because when you had Europe, the king is the king and the nobility are the nobility because they have land.
Mm-hmm.
And the land that is handed down by God to them means that they are different from you. And that
Mm-hmm.
was a pretty easy social order that you have peasants and you have nobles, and that's that.
Right.
If
Right.
you're landed, you're a person, and if you're not, you're less than a person. And then the British bring that system to America, and then it doesn't work because you have this guy on the other end of the world being like, "Hey, I have some land in England, so I'm actually better than you, and you need to do what I say." And George Washington,
No,
"Man, I got orchards
no.
and fields. I got a bunch of land. Who are you? Get out of here."
Yeah, not
And
happening
that,
anymore.
and so there is the architect, when he's designing that, the urban planners, you see that in a lot of American architecture. They're like, well, we can't just say, church, castle, and is the architecture anymore. It has to be more for the people. I mean, yes, the president is here and there are, nobles in America, but then how do we make the number 6 talk to the number 5? How do we make the earth and its people be in communion with, and all of a sudden you get this, and I mean, it's, for lack of a better word, it's democratic. It's not just like, well, the church is beautiful, everything else is a peon hovel with rats. It's like, you can't, that design language fails, of
Right.
nobles live in a castle and you live in a thatched hut, because how do you, so I'm kind of failing to put this succinctly, but they needed a new language for design,
Right.
and a lot of
Right.
DC has a struggle to find that.
Well, yeah, L'Enfant, one of the reasons that I think he didn't really tell people what he was up to, um, this was all unknown. There was an Englishman named Nicholas Mann who wrote a book on L'Enfant's design for DC, and he sort of reverse engineered the whole process and discovered what L'Enfant was up to. So L'Enfant didn't tell anybody about this trellis. And I think largely because of what you were saying, it was very old world. It was kind of too highfalutin for America in a sense. We're much more leveled. And what he was up to was too spiritual and intellectual, perhaps, for
It's esoteric.
this newly liberated uh, democratic nation just wasn't thinking in those terms. But I think something that you had alluded to earlier, that sort of the third phase of what we need to do of bringing the two sides back together. It's like with the scientific revolution being this second phase of human experience. It's like being a teenager in a sense, being a 13-year-old and experimenting, and you've got to rebel against your parents in order to create your own autonomy, which is sort of intellectually what science has done. We've broken away from the past, but you can't stay in that stage forever. You've got to mature into wholeness eventually. So how do you take what L'Enfant was trying to do in making the city a metaphor in language and in form that the 21st century scientific community can understand and learn from? So that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Well, and I think, in the same way in Jungian psychology, the self isn't a destination. It's this process of kind of remembering where you come from, but you can't hold everything, and then coming back to an ego, but still, keeping in contact with a more spiritual center, but one you can't live in. Architecture is kind of that too. In the article I had about Frank Lloyd Wright, I said what I liked about Wright's design that made him, I think, not just a modernist like Frank Gehry that's throwing out everything. I mean, I feel like with Frank Gehry, you could go to him on different days and ask for the same design, and you would get a different structure. He would wad up a piece of paper differently in AutoCAD. Somebody like Wright, you would have, even if you wiped his memory, he would have designed almost the same structure because his process was pretty consistent. He said, I want to look at the natural world. I want to look at the function of the building. How do these people actually live? I'm going to study what they're doing. And then I'm going to look at a greater spiritual purpose of the space, which is always a guess. And sometimes he got it wrong. I mean, but he put those things together, this is the pattern in the natural world around it. And that's going to ripple through the building. This is the way that the people use the structure. I'm going to make that pattern fuse with the nature. And then what is a greater spiritual ideal that I can infuse with this? And, the buildings are kind of like altars in that way. But and that makes him, he threw out all of the, Art Nouveau, or not Art Nouveau, what's the word? Beaux Arts, classical detail. But he also wasn't totally a modernist, because he was adhering to this kind of pretty timeless structure.
Well, that generation could do that, because while they were creating a modernist sensibility, they were trained in that old Beaux-Arts manner. Now, that's been gone for 100 years. Nobody knows how to draw a circle anymore, or a curve. It's just straight lines. And the past has been so completely dismissed that my understanding of, I went to architecture school, but I was in the urban planning program, so no design training in that sense. But what I see coming out of architecture school is, not only does your design have to be different, but every time your process is going to be different as well, because you have to create a new one-time language and process to create this one-time building. Everything, it's almost like a really severe form of jazz theory. Every piece of music has to be played differently every time you play it, or you're just compromising. And
it's interesting you said that people are expected to reinvent a new process every time. In architecture school, I haven't been to architecture school, so I don't know trends in that field. Or at least, I know them from the 70s vernacular architecture and stuff, but
right.
Not after that.
Yeah. Well, it's it's a really difficult thing that I think to try and overcome, because when you're in a mindset that discounts everything except itself, I think it takes a civilizational collapse. I'm not sure that it's something that can be reformed incrementally.
Well, it's like craftsmen in architecture. Wright could come in and say, I kind of want this pattern to repeat, and trust the tradesmen that were skilled enough to do that. I mean, we don't have any skilled labor left in this country. We outsourced everything in the 80s, but got tail end of industry, got sent overseas. We don't make anything. And we don't, that knowledge is institutional. It's like people were talking about, the SpaceX and Boeing, all these companies are trying to build these big rockets to lift cargo. They were like, we were building the Saturn V. We had the heavy lifter rocket. I'm not terribly into rocket science, but they're like, we had all this stuff in the 70s and 80s. Why? This is 1950s designs, built in the 60s and 70s. Like, why can't you just go back and do it? You already did it. And people were like, none of the infrastructure is there. None of the people are there. There are people who knew just how to make that ring. There were whole supply chains to get this type of mineral to be, all of that's gone. You have to restart with the ability to build that you have. And we have less ability to build now in 2023 than we had in 1950.
It just makes me think my ex-father-in-law was an aeronautical engineer with Pratt and Whitney. All he did for his 35-year career was design fan blades for jet engines. That's it. That's all he did. Just how long, what's the angle of the curve, what metal do you use? That's all he did. And so with this sort of specialization,
which is a lifetime of experience that you can't just read a book or plug in a formula into a computer program and then get that expertise back. It's half art, half science, even in the hard sciences.
Yeah, and that's discounted. Yeah.
Well, I know a lot of people, the decline in architecture and urban planning and cities you're talking about, is written about in 1880. But a lot of the things people tie that to, or I've heard people make a case for, is about planned obsolescence and the American families' access to debt. that what happens is that you have this precious cameo that came from England with your family or whatever, and it stays in the family, and these things are special and they kind of define the family. And we would build a chair to be taken apart and sanded down and last a lifetime. You're not building things that are disposable. And then all of a sudden these companies figure out that you can make more money if you make the person buy the thing every year. But the problem is they don't have enough money to do it. So you sell in the future and you say, okay, well, go ahead and get the washing machine today and then pay it off over 2 years, and it'll break in a year and you'll need another one. And that changes the way that we live. And this way where we stop trying to, we just start trying to survive, and get the thing that we have to have, not the thing that we want or that is beautiful or that enriches our lives, but just, okay, I have to have a car, I have to have a washing machine, I have to have a dishwasher, I have to have a garbage disposal, I have to have this. And then they're breaking, and that process of maintenance and all that becomes something that,
and
takes away.
The time and psychic energy involved. I'm quite well educated. I've got a master's degree and a number of postgraduate training. I'm not the smartest one on the bus, but by no means a dummy. And it's overwhelming. We have to choose our trash hauler and where we get our electricity from, and who we're going to get our telephone service from, and on and on, and all these choices. And you have to do research and and it's just overwhelming. Just like you said, surviving rather than flourishing is a full-time effort. And I can understand why there's a generational shift so I spent a lot of time with 30-somethings, 20-somethings on a regular basis. And there's this attitude that, whatever, I'll buy the $20 IKEA chair instead of the $100, better one, because it's not going to be around. I'm going to move anyway. Everything is disposable now.
That was IKEA's ad in Sweden, was like a lamp on the curb, and it had this sad music, and then it was like, don't feel bad for the lamp that's in the trash, and the guy's carrying a new lamp. And that was the original IKEA ad. It was like, don't feel bad to throw all this stuff away.
Yeah.
You can get a new one.
We do it to ourselves now.
Yeah.
We bought into it, and it's just easier to go along.
Well, and a lot of modernism, like AI or something, it's like people are like, hey, this is kind of a bad idea, but we can't quit doing it because this is the way it's going. And if I quit doing it, I'm behind,
Right.
There's no one knows how to stop it, but they do agree that it's not a good idea to do the thing that we're doing today, and we'll continue to do more tomorrow.
I'm not sure what problem AI is intended to solve.
Well, and I think
what are we going to be able to do in the future that we've never been able to do before? Well, nothing I've been told.
Well, the microcosm of American access to debt affecting all this stuff also spills out, 20 years later into economy. And so it's like, nobody wants to just say, all right, I'm going to go to the factory and make the thing and then go home and have this life, and we can have a middle class. Everybody is like, we'll throw 80% of the country into poverty to try and gamble that maybe you'll be one of the ones that gets to be a billionaire. And there's this strange thing where it's like, you can have a company that makes a really good product that works really well, and nobody wants to fund it, and it doesn't work. But you can be a country a company that says, well, I'm going to be a monopoly, and we're just chasing this monopoly. Like Amazon was a company that sold books, and then they turned into this company that wanted to sell you every single thing that existed. And they're not even like a great bookstore anymore. Like, that's forgotten. Just being a bookstore is not enough. Twitter was this thing that worked pretty well. Like, people were sharing information and everything, and it wasn't rewarded. It didn't make money. It had to be, you have to have some crazy pipe dream vision. but they never really pay off. I mean, Netflix, borrowed all this money and made all this stuff. Now they're going bankrupt and trying to figure out how to make money. People don't realize none of these companies make money. They're still burning through venture capital. That's where we are. Like Spotify loses money. Pandora loses money. Uber loses. They lose billions of dollars, because everyone's hoping, well, maybe when Uber is a complete monopoly, then the self-driving car will mean we don't have to pay the driver, and then that will be a model to profitability. But that's a pipe dream of a guess. Depending on AI being able to do certain things, or I don't even know what the pitch for Spotify being profitable is. I mean, they lose $1 million a day. But all of these things are based on this fantasy of the future that's going to be huge. And there's not just, I want to do a job, I'm going to go in and do this thing well. That isn't rewarded anymore.
Well, this is a result of the mindset that started back in the 1600s. So that scientific revolution, when you're not connected to something larger in a cosmological sense, this is the result. Or the alternative would be what the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution provided, which is the death of tens of millions of people. So there has to be, as little as we understand or respect the spiritual value of religion, if it's not there, the results are not to be surprising. This is just what happens.
Well, I mean, and maybe another way of saying that is that if there's no higher spiritual principle, if there's no higher aspiration or ability to transcend our, base instincts, then all of life is just this competition that is pretty soulless and pretty depersonalizing.
Well, that's what Nietzsche said, and most people misunderstand his quote, "God is dead." People today think that was a call to liberation, and he saw that very much as a disaster.
Society losing its center.
Society loses its center. It's going to fall apart and explode. And World War I, World War II, the entire 20th century, following his prediction, saw how many tens, hundreds of millions of people slaughtered. And we're in a point of relative peace right now. And
they couldn't tell you why. World War I, it's like they're looking at the world and it's like, what did we do? Why did we do that?
Yeah. Well, for the same reasons that you personally, you, me, everyone else, all of us as individuals commit small little mistakes, errors, so on and so forth. Anything that you see going wrong in society is going wrong in you as well. And so
one of the things, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
There's a little bit of a lag. Sometimes I'll start talking and then I hear like the middle of a word, and I think the noise canceling is shaving off the beginning and the ends of the talking sometimes. That's
all right. Go ahead.
But I was curious. I mean, one of the things that the Venus of Willendorf is a pretty big one, where for those who aren't familiar, like one of the earliest, they call them like the earliest religious artifacts or something. And the reason is, when mankind's evolving and the things that you can find some tools and things, but they're practical. They're a knife or a stabber or a, scraper or something. And then all of a sudden you see these things that are just for beauty. And that it's telling you that people are kind of trying to figure out a deeper spiritual or artistic function, that they're not just worried about surviving. They're also trying to figure out, what makes them alive or how to be alive, or there's some question about identity. And so the first figures in largely caves around France are these, like very round, very rotund women figures that they're guessing were about fertility. And, the fattest woman is the most healthy and births the most babies. And it was some kind of, maybe the supernatural blessing of fertility or just a honoring of fertility or something. But the Venus of Willendorf is one of the most famous. I don't think it's the oldest, but it's maybe one of the first found. And that's a big place where humanity is looking at itself, and the brain has developed precuneus. And so it's able to perceive itself as this thing outside of the world around it. And no longer is it just processing information, it's actually perceiving it. And part of that perception is self-perception, and then we wonder what we are. It creates this anxiety and all these problems. What's the joke is, God took a perfectly good monkey and gave it anxiety. But another kind of big formative thing, I think, is the first cities. Like, we always assumed, because it's the way modern society works, that when people came together to build these cities, and it happened a couple different places, it wasn't just like one spot, that we did it because it was more safe, or that we would be able to have more food, or that quality of life was better, and that more people kind of doing work. Well, that's a pretty industrial revolution idea. Really, when you go and you look at these cities that people are coming together to build, the quality of life went down. People had less access to food. They had to work more. They lived less long, yet they still did it. We're called, to build some kind of project there. And I always thought that was an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's the usual. Not, I don't know about the usual, but quite often you'll hear that cities are simply that artifact of the patriarchy, in which leaders could control the masses. So cities and religion have that negative connotation because they're all about control. And I think what you said about being called to do something, yeah, we evolutionarily we grew out of our monkey background. We still have the monkey brain that the Buddhists talk about.
And the lizard brain beneath it.
The lizard brain is way back here and it's still jumping around. But that process of psychological awakening seems to provoke us to create in ways that no other species does. Lots of other species will, prairie dogs make prairie dog towns, and bees make hives, and lots of animals make homes for themselves, birds in their nests. But humans go in a different direction that isn't necessarily practical. We do things for metaphorical reasons. There's some concept or idea that doesn't help us survive, but we think makes life better somehow. And that's one of the strongest drives we have. And you just can't deny it. It's like the writing of this book for me. I was impelled to do that. It wasn't something that I was planning on doing or had always hoped to do. I was, in a sense, I was sort of forced to do it. So there's something that's trying to burst out from the unconscious and make itself real. And for me, the greatest, certainly the largest thing that we build physically is a city. It's the largest manifestation of human desire. And we've really done it very, very badly for 300-400 years, at least 100 years here in the United States. How do you reorient that? So I think L'Enfant was pointing the way. L'Enfant did not have any particular personal spiritual attitude. I don't think he was a particularly thoughtful person. We would probably call him he'd be somewhere on the autistic spectrum today.
Yeah.
Maybe something of a narcissist.
Well, I think a lot of obsessive creatives, maybe they're not all on the spectrum. Some of them are, but they have that similar type, the Steve Jobs, the whatever. They see this vision and they're forcing it to be born. And the people who have that impulse a little less lightly maybe don't get that project done. They don't ram it through.
Yeah. Well, he was not well liked. Washington.
Why was he selected? What was it that made them select him?
Washington deeply respected him, knew that he was kind of, again, today we would at a minimum call him a jerk. So L'Enfant's story, he was the son of a court architect, court artist, under Louis XIV. His father painted all the grand artwork for the king. And so L'Enfant was raised in Versailles and the courts of the king and so on and so forth. So he had that classic Baroque understanding of art and design. And he was well placed to end up in a very, very socially, upwardly, upward movement professionally and socially. But when he was, whatever, 20 years old or something, he came to America to fight in the revolution. I think he was very much passionate about glory and all that sort of thing. And, you know,
There wasn't going to be a war in France during his lifetime. He needed to find one.
he went and found one. And he served under Washington, Valley Forge. He met Hamilton and all the major players of the time. And he just had an artistic flair. He worked as a military engineer during the war, building redoubts for cannon and so forth, and was wounded during the war and ended up as an architect in New York. And his major project there was two. First was converting City Hall in New York to the Continental Congressional Hall where Congress could meet. And he did a fine job there. He was hired to design some of the early coins and medallions and so forth for the nation. And he designed the first inauguration for George Washington, put together the whole big event. And then it came time to select the location for the new Capitol. And that's really, really what L'Enfant had hoped to do. And he wrote to Washington specifically asking for that job, and Washington gave it to him. So they had that personal connection, and Washington knew of his skill.
And
So,
I don't really know much about Washington's design taste. I mean, it was what I guess you'd call that colonial architecture at that point, and he had an ovular room in a house that he liked, and so the White House architect kind of. All I know about his architectural taste is that he liked oval rooms, or at least the architect thought that.
That may be Thomas Jefferson. There's an oval room in Monticello.
I thought the White House design was.
Yeah, that was James Hoban, I believe, who designed the White House. L'Enfant had designed buildings for both the White House and the president.
No, I don't mean L'Enfant designing the White House. I just was saying I knew that when Washington was choosing the White House plan, that was what the architect. I don't remember the name of the architect of the White House, but that he had done a bunch of oval rooms because he thought that Washington liked one from his house. That's all I know about his architectural taste. What about Washington, other than the friend connection, would make him choose L'Enfant's designs?
Well, he really did. So what's interesting, Washington and Jefferson had two very, very different mindsets. Jefferson despised cities, and Jefferson had come up with a design for the city that was like 10 square blocks.
He wanted like rural agrarian kingdoms, like all these farmsteads surrounded by, farmland, basically, right. Like the house as the city. But then the thing that was so silly about that is it's like, who are you selling the product to? If everyone is living on a farm, there is nobody who is buying your stuff, so you can drink all this French wine.
That's right.
But Jefferson wasn't really. Well, he wasn't that great at finances or economics, as we had some good ideas about metaphor and government, but I mean, he dies penniless. Library of Congress exists just because they threw him a book by buying his library, so he couldn't afford to eat. I mean, he just really sat back on his farm talking about how cities were bad, everyone should live on a farm, ordering luxurious products from France and Italy. Into going into debt from cities in Europe, writing about how he hated cities. Like, it's just, I mean, so silly.
There's no farm without a city. and there's no city without a farm. So that was a real tension early on. But Washington was very much more of an empire builder. He really, although it was interestingly, it was Jefferson who completed the Louisiana Purchase, which is where, in fact, the reason that our Midwest today is so spread out and gridded, Jefferson basically laid out the entire area of the Louisiana Purchase, what we now know as the Midwest. How many states? 10, 15 states, whatever it is, in 160-acre plots, in a grid. And yeah, he thought that we should all be yeoman farmers, and that would be heaven on earth. But Washington was very different. He understood that the United States had the potential to become a global superpower, not just economically or politically, but philosophically.
He's the origin of the city on a hill idea. You know, he felt like the old order was dying, and he was ushering in a new one with birthing this nation that was ultimately going to be the model of all nations.
And the whole point was democracy, spreading democracy. That's always been what the U.S. has been about. And in order to, in people's minds, infuse a lot of hope and desire and understanding of this, he and L'Enfant both agreed that the capital city should be absolutely magnificent and reflect that level of value in its design.
It's designed almost like a garden. Like you look at the layout, it looks like, you know, the gardens of Versailles or something, the way it kind of unfolds and is bifurcated with streets and everything. It's not designed the way that European cities were.
Well, in fact, L'Enfant grew up with spending time in Versailles, and a lot of people some authors have pointed to that as the source of L'Enfant's inspiration, but L'Enfant did something different. In Versailles, the angled pathways and streets all converge in one particular place, the king's bedroom. That's where visually all the paths lead to the king's bedroom. That's where all the power lay. What L'Enfant was doing was something much more dispersed. The power was in three places. He placed the Capitol building at the center of the people, not the White House. The Capitol is the centerpiece. The White House also, the streets, both for the Capitol and the White House, the streets don't terminate on the center of the building. They terminate in the doorways. So when you look at a map, you'll see, for instance, Pennsylvania Avenue going through in front of the White House, but it's actually kind of offset because the streets don't intersect in the middle of the building. They arrive at the doorways. People are welcome here. That's the idea. So L'Enfant had and Washington both shared this vision of a very, very different political order. So Novus Ordo Seclorum was, you know, that new world order was very much what they were all about.
Well, and I think that was something that Washington saw too, because of what we were talking about in the beginning, that idea of land, that he saw this country had land that went on and on. Like it sort of threw a wrench in America's seemingly infinite resources, sort of threw a wrench in every European philosopher's plans. You know, even Marx was like, I don't, you know, like
what do I do with
labor theory doesn't really work if land is free, but eventually they'll run out of it. You'll see, you know, and Jung was afraid of America. He saw the capacity for the kind of charismatic religious movements and just power. But I think Washington, it wasn't that he was in this disagreement where he was like, well, I want to leave Britain and they're taxing us or something, in the way that Franklin and some of the other ones were. And I think he really saw this old order that says that your power is handed down by God because you have a plot of land in England does not work anymore. There's all this land, man. Like, you're not going to get to tell me or these people what to do. And it wasn't as personal for him. I think he felt like it was an inevitability. If he didn't do it, it would be done by someone else.
Well,
It was just, there was a breaking away that was going to happen. And that all of the European order was based on that. So America had to represent this new thing that was the next thing that they couldn't see there yet.
And I think that took some time for the founding fathers, certainly a certain group of them, because they were the American equivalent of the aristocracy. They were all the big wealthy landowners, and what they were doing was creating a system in which their legacy personally wasn't going to continue. Most of the founding fathers at the beginning of the war, I don't think wanted to leave. They didn't want to break away. They simply wanted more autonomy, but they loved their connection to England and so forth. But over the course of time, the relationship with England got so bad. It's just goofy little things like the Boston Tea Party. What caused that? The interesting story there. From what I understand, the Mughal Empire in India had collapsed, and England, through the East India Company, basically took over. And for a variety of economic reasons, all of a sudden the tea trade was in an uproar, and they had all this tea, and there was no place to ship it. So they decided to bring a whole lot of tea to the Americas. And what they ended up doing was actually lowering the price of tea, but adding a tax to it. So let's say before all of this happened, tea cost $1 a pound, whatever it was. After the East India Company took on control when the Mughal Empire collapsed, tea was down to 90 cents a pound, but the British added a 5-cent tax to it. So tea was actually cheaper, but there was now a tax. What a stupid thing to rebel against. We're giving you something cheaper.
Everyone
Why
wins.
are you so angry? But it was just this. It was one of those Jungian moments where the archetype breaks in, and it's time for a large change. This is how we're going to make it happen.
Well, I think that is one of those kind of very American archetypes, is freedom, for the lack of a better word, but it's a rebellious freedom. Like, we have the right to do this, even though it's the wrong thing to do, is a fight that we have over and over again. It's like, I guess
I'm gonna hurt myself on principle just to show you.
Yeah, you do get that. There is that kind of trickster archetype. And
that's what Gill was afraid of with America. There's just so much power and capability in a very, very psychologically immature as a culture.
Yeah, I think he saw it as a teenage country. It was starting to act up and rebel against Dad. Its mineral deposits were just coming in, and
right.
Kind of going through an awkward growth spurt, and
but I think it was necessary. When you think about Jung and his reconciliation of opposites, well, there has to be an opposite to reconcile. In a sense, we had to go through, at least up to this point, 500 years of the scientific revolution and this technological, bureaucratic way of thinking in order to have something to integrate and bring that together.
Well, and other countries had an anchored identity hundreds of years before the scientific revolution. So they sort of had more of an anchor, even though that changed a lot of things. America was one of the first countries built solely on it,
Right. So it's going to be, where would we say we are now? The frat boy is graduated from college and has to get a grown-up job now, so to speak.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that gets lost in American history too, is it's like in the middle of the Industrial Revolution is the main growth of America. And so some of the reason so much industry came here was that you couldn't reinvent the same thing in Europe, but you could steal patents in America because they weren't going to extradite you. So you could just memorize the way that this cotton gin worked or this boot, stamping factory, and then draw it on a napkin, sail to America, and become a millionaire.
Yeah,
with this brand new technology.
Yeah, that's exactly. Well, that's how tea got to India. There was no tea in India. It was purely Chinese, and they controlled it very tightly. And the English sent a spy to, I don't know, somewhere in China, stole a bunch of seeds and took them to Darjeeling in India, and started the Indian, because the Chinese were starting to tax too much or something like that. So yeah, this is how the world works. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting stuff. I mean, I guess maybe to wrap up, like if somebody, says, okay, you're talking about all these highfalutin ideas that you should have spirituality in your bricks and mortar and under your streets, but what does that look like specifically? What are you advocating for us to do differently? Somebody like Creer wants us to go back to the early European city, wants to turn all the buildings back into Greek temples, and to have a pedestrian-oriented society instead of a car-oriented society. I mean, he goes as far as to say that no one should be able to use any building materials made out of petroleum; that all should be natural. And Dwani is very much in the walkable city, and that cities should be used the way that we should think about their function. I mean, what are your rules, for the lack of a better word? What is your thesis about what we need to do?
It's interesting you mentioned Creer's perspective on going back to some ancient way. My understanding is that Hillman's real desire was for us to all go back and worship Aphrodite.
That was the one question he couldn't answer. There's a famous, you never see Hillman speechless. He never shut up. And somebody from Canada, I think professor, said, you keep saying that we need to go back to polytheism, we need to go back to Greek. I think if you let Hillman go, he would have gone back to the mother cult. He wanted to totally regress into the unconscious, and he would have kept going. But the guy said, you keep talking about polytheism and the Greeks and all this stuff. Why should we do that? They abandoned that way for monotheism.
Right.
Like the Greeks gave all of that up to convert to Christianity, which is why there's so much Greek inside of it. So why, if they did that, why should we go back? And Hillman's like,
I don't know.
Yeah. He doesn't have an answer.
Hadn't thought that one through yet. So the book is in large part a sort of an exposition of my perspective on what we've been talking about, the history of human psychological awakening. But I also discuss the process of building a city from a design perspective. And in that, I basically go through the design elements that you'll find in the Congress for New Urbanism, the Charter of the New Urbanism. And I get into, there's actually a chapter on finance, how we finance the places we build. So what's the old adage? Form follows function. And from a developer's perspective, form follows finance. And so a lot of issues that we have now, as far as an individual building and public infrastructure, have to do with the way we finance things and the way that, we simply can't do certain things because of the way that the money flows. And the money flows in certain ways because of the value that they place on it. It's an end in itself rather than a tool. As far as the specific design elements, one of the things that I did was to take, so the issues that we're faced with now, global warming, climate change, the death of shopping malls and office parks and so on and so forth, there's a real shift physically. Nationwide, we're vastly over retailed. Got so much retail.
And now brick and mortar stores are going away in favor of online shopping. So we have all these abandoned Walmarts we're converting into mega churches, and all of these abandoned strip malls that we're converting into, vape stores.
Right. Yeah. So what do you do with that stuff?
And title loan stores too.
And so I conducted an experiment. Years ago, I was the chairman of the City Planning Commission in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And their big shopping mall in town off to the side. More recently, they have lost something like 60% of their stores, and they're struggling just like hundreds of other malls across the country. So I decided to do a little personal experiment and use something akin to L'Enfant's methodology to turn this, what was 160-acre shopping mall, 200-acre shopping mall, into a walkable neighborhood. And so I created that sort of an underlying trellis, geometric trellis on the property. And out of that grew a street pattern of a new traditional neighborhood that is comparable to the downtown of the old historic city. And the points and lines and angles of that geometric trellis form the location of the entrance to a park, a children's playground, a library, a city hall. In other words, it creates a network of sort of like a dispersed civic commons, so that you're walking from one place to another, but you're always a part of the community. Think of so I was raised Episcopalian, not Catholic, but we also, like the Catholics, had the Stations of the Cross in a church, where the interior of the church.
I grew up Episcopalian too. We used to call it Catholic Light because.
Okay.
I remember confirmation class was like, it'd be like, this is what Baptists believe, this is what Catholics believe. We don't really tell you. You can pick,
Yeah,
a new one. But there's nothing that confirmation class wasn't really
right. Yeah, that's fine.
Not anything.
Yeah. So in the interior of a church, there will be a series of works of art, statuary, paintings, and so forth, tapestries that depict the last days of Christ's life before the crucifixion. So they're like these little stations of learning. And so perhaps the idea is to expand those stations of the cross out throughout the entire city, so that there are points of inspiration and learning along a path that you can create throughout the entire city. So this might be connections from open space to another, civic structures like City Hall or the library or the school, what have you, community garden, and link these things thematically so that together they tell a story and provoke in you questions through the urban design and also the elements of design that are placed in there. So one of the things that L'Enfant failed to do was basically tell people what he was doing. So it was not clear that these 2 points of the Capitol and the White House represented something larger. We have some vague notion, but what I think we need now is something clear and specific.
Well, so and maybe a good wrap up is, we see what Jung would have designed as an architect, because he put a lot of thought into Bollingen, and he built as much of Bollingen by hand as he could. So we kind of see what his architectural ideal was. But if Jung was to build a city, if he was to be an urban planner, how do you think he would have thought? How would he have laid out something like that?
He left a little bit of a legacy like that. I guess it's in the Red Book, I think.
Hmm.
It came out of his Liverpool dream, right? Where he had that dream of the tree and the lamppost on an island in the middle of the city. And there's a beautiful little rendition of that. Um, Given his background and history and so forth, that has a very much a medieval look. If you know the Italian military town, Palmanova,
Hmm.
shaped like a star with a moat around it. That's kind of that probably influenced what Jung did with his Liverpool dream, something like that. Um, so there are a lot of possibilities to do a lot of different things on these old abandoned sites like shopping malls and so forth. Existing towns, that's going to be a really, really much more difficult sort of effort, I think, to sort of retrofit this concept into existing places.
Mm.
I think it's necessary when we look at maps of sea level rise, for instance, in the coming decades. You know, New York is at risk. My home area of Tidewater, Virginia.
And
Uh,
they're building anything in Miami is just so unreal to me.
yeah, Miami is. I've already
Millions
seen.
of dollars of new construction in Miami. It's going to be
And
2 feet underwater in 10 years.
no, they already are. You can see photographs of Miami Beach under 6 inches of water on a regular basis now. So all of those people are going to have to decant somewhere. And we're starting to see after Katrina, half of New Orleans ended up in Houston. So how do these sort of receiver cities prepare themselves for an influx of refugees?
So buy real estate in the Midwest. Is that what you're saying?
There's been a map made of areas which are um, most likely to um, be able to receive an influx of new people. Um, I think the safest place is something like the center of Michigan, something like that, where no floods, no hurricanes, no tornadoes. Um, Temperature is going to be okay. Um, so communities, if we simply respond to this sort of environmental crisis in sort of a panic mode, we've got to build more stuff quickly because people are coming. So just get it done, like an engineering project. We're going to be creating future slums. So this sort of transition has to be done thoughtfully. And I think for the first time in history, humanity has the opportunity to sort of look ahead and see major global changes coming, not just environmentally, but cosmologically. The way we think about ourselves and the world is changing. And, and we have the opportunity to prepare for that.
Do you have faith that we will?
Eventually. But I really don't think Churchill said Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And I think we will fight tooth and nail to hang on to the status quo until we're forced to change our ways. Yeah. So, yeah, it won't be pretty.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. I would love if people want to buy the book. Is there a way that you prefer them to do that? Do you make more money if they buy it directly?
Yeah, I actually if I hand you a book by hand, it's best. But most sales will be through Amazon.
Okay. You're gonna do an audiobook version? So many of my
eventually.
Yeah, all my younger people, like just everybody under 30, that's how they consume all their books at work and stuff.
Yeah. There is an ebook for $9.99. The hard copy from Amazon is, I think, $35. Barnes and Noble and 3 or 4 other outlets as well.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of most cities have like a or states have like a Jung society or whatever, and they do talks once a week or whatever. But Jungians like Jungian thought spilling into other areas. That may be a good marketing thing if you make it
Well,
See if
in
they'll email
fact,
their group or let you come talk. I know there's one
yeah,
here.
I gave
Atlanta's is a lot bigger than Birmingham's. You probably want to go to the bigger cities. Chicago's incredibly active too.
Chicago, very definitely. I did give a lecture at the Young Society here in Washington 2 years ago, I think, and met James Hollis through that process, and fabulous guy. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm wide open for. In fact, I've got one lecture to my professional new urbanist group here in town, and looking for more.
Well, great. That sounds wonderful. Well, good luck to you. And is there anything that you'd like to add, or website we can check out? Anything that helps you other than people getting the book on Amazon?
Well, I am in the process of starting a nonprofit and an associated website, the Institute for Symbolic Urbanism.
Okay.
And that is in process, and it will be basically the ground on which I will try to refine some of these ideas into something workable for the future. If you have an interest in Jung and place, psychological growth, and urbanism, it would be great to be able to put the two together into sort of a new way of thinking about and doing urbanism.
You didn't want to go for the new urbanism, or Congress for the new urbanism?
There's a friend of mine has a Kevin Klinkenberg has a really great podcast, and where he's questioning with the viability of the Congress for New Urbanism. It may be spreading out into other groups. There's the Strong Towns movement. All those. So
I don't think they all agree on the philosophy anymore like they did in the beginning. It's starting to have new hypotheses about what the best path forward is.
Well, that's kind of a good thing. After COVID and what's happened with downtown office space, for instance, there's a lot of rethinking that has to be done. New urbanism started out as a way of doing better suburbia. Maybe that has been rethought quite a bit, and it may not need to be the focus anymore.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I appreciate your time. And I guess, what do you have the name of the website, or can you say that, or we'll put it in the show notes too?
I think it's just isu.org.
Okay, isu.org.
Oh, I'm sorry. Symbolicurbanism.org.
Okay, symbolicurbanism.org.
Yeah, and it'll be up in, oh Lord, maybe 6 weeks, September.
Okay, you want us to hold the episode until it's live, or go ahead and put it out?
You can hold it for a couple of weeks. That would be fine.
Well, it's totally up to you. Whatever's more helpful. I don't know if you want to. If the book's for sale, we can. Sometimes the Amazon algorithm likes more. If you have more out the gate, then it keeps it up there longer.
Yeah, you know what? Go ahead and do it as you will. No need to wait.
Okay.
Because I'm actually going to bring in some professional help. What I've done so far on the website is kind of amateurish, and so it might be a couple more months than I anticipate. So go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, we're happy to go ahead and get that live. And thank you for sitting down with us. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and but be sure and check out Will's website and other projects as they come available.